Deep within the high mountains of Tibet, at a bend in a river so remote that most maps barely mark it, workers are carving 4 tunnels through the side of a mountain, each one 20 kilometers long, wide enough to swallow a river whole. When they finish, they will have redirected one of the most powerful rivers on Earth through solid rock, dropping it 2,000 meters in the span of just 50 kilometers, and unleashing enough electricity to power the entire United Kingdom. It will be the single most expensive infrastructure project ever built by human hands, more costly than the International Space Station, bigger than anything else on the planet, and 650 kilometers downstream, across a border that 2 nuclear-armed nations have fought and died over, one government is watching every shovel of dirt with something close to genuine dread. This is the story of the Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon hydropower project, and it might be the most consequential dam most people outside Asia have never heard of. Let's start with the raw scale of what China is actually building, because the numbers here are almost difficult to process. The dam sits on the lower reaches of the Yarlung Tsangpo River in the Ningxi region of Tibet, at a place where the river makes an extraordinary hairpin turn around a mountain called Namcha Barwa, plunging through what geologists consider the deepest canyon on the surface of the Earth, deeper by a wide margin than the Grand Canyon carved by the Colorado River in Arizona. Over just 50 kilometers, the river drops roughly 2,000 meters in elevation. That combination, enormous water volume, dramatic elevation change, concentrated into a short stretch of river, makes this single location one of the most promising hydropower sites anywhere on the planet, which is exactly why Chinese engineers have had their eyes on it for decades. The project's official price tag sits at roughly 1.2 trillion yuan, somewhere between 167 and 170 billion US dollars, depending on the exchange rate used and which portion of the broader cascade you're counting. Once complete, it's expected to generate around 300 billion kilowatt hours of electricity every single year. That's roughly equal to the entire annual electricity consumption of the United Kingdom, a country of over 67 million people, generated from a single hydropower complex. To put that in a comparison that actually lands, China's existing Three Gorges Dam, currently the largest hydroelectric facility on Earth, and one of the most famous engineering projects in modern history, generates about a third of what this new project is projected to produce once fully operational. This isn't an upgrade to the world's biggest dam. It's designed to triple it. Construction officially began on July 19, 2025, following formal government approval granted on Christmas Eve the year before. Chinese Premier Li Qiang personally attended the groundbreaking ceremony, calling it, in his own words, the project of the century. State media coverage has leaned hard into that framing, presenting the dam as a triumphant symbol of China's clean energy ambitions, a critical piece of the country's plan to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and reach full net zero emissions by 2060. And a source of thousands of new construction jobs, and expanded infrastructure across some of China's most remote and underdeveloped territory. From Beijing's perspective, this is a story about national achievement, harnessing one of the most powerful untapped rivers left on the planet, using it to power an increasingly electrified Chinese economy, and doing it entirely within China's own sovereign borders. But 650 kilometers downstream, the story looks completely different. The Yarlung Tsangpo doesn't stay in China. It crosses the border into India's Arunachal Pradesh state, where it becomes known as the Siang River, before widening out across Assam and transforming into the mighty Brahmaputra, one of the great rivers of South Asia, a lifeline that more than 130 million people across India and Bangladesh depend on for irrigation, drinking water, fishing, and the basic rhythms of daily agricultural life. And that's precisely where the fear begins, because for the very first time, the river that sustains tens of millions of people across 2 sovereign nations is about to have its upper reaches controlled almost entirely by a single foreign government, one that India has fought an actual war against, one it still holds unresolved and highly sensitive border disputes with, and one it does not currently trust to share basic operational data about how much water is being held back, redirected, or released downstream. India's objections started well before the first shovel hit the ground. According to statements made in India's parliament, the government issued a formal diplomatic protest, known as a démarche, on December 30th, 2024. The same week, China approved the project, urging Beijing to ensure the interests of downstream nations wouldn't be harmed, and to maintain transparency with the countries whose rivers originate on the Tibetan Plateau. India's Ministry of External Affairs has repeatedly called on China to consult with downstream countries and safeguard what international water law generally recognizes as the established rights of lower riparian states, the countries positioned further down a shared river system. External Affairs. Minister S. Jaishankar personally raised the issue directly with Chinese counterparts during a diplomatic visit in July 2025, specifically pressing for the resumption of hydrological data sharing that had previously been suspended between the two countries. China's response consistently has been reassurance without much substantive detail. The project, Beijing insists, is a run-of-river design, meaning water gets diverted through tunnels to generate power and then returned to the river's natural course rather than held back in a massive reservoir the way conventional dams typically operate. Officials maintain this approach won't significantly reduce the water actually reaching India and Bangladesh. Whether that reassurance is actually convincing is a different question entirely, and it's one where even the engineering community is divided. Let's start with the fear that dominates the political conversation in India, because it isn't really about drought, at least not primarily. It's about what Indian officials and commentators have started calling China's ability to deploy water bombs. The concern goes like this. Even if the dam operates exactly as China describes on a day-to-day basis, the sheer scale of infrastructure being built gives Beijing an unprecedented amount of physical control over a river that India depends on completely, and that control could, in theory, be weaponized during a moment of serious diplomatic or military tension between the two countries. A sudden, deliberate release of water could trigger catastrophic flash flooding downstream in Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, regions that already sit along one of the most militarized and disputed borders on Earth. Alternatively, in a lower drama but still damaging scenario, China could simply hold back water during a critical dry season, disrupting irrigation and drinking water supplies for tens of millions of people at a moment of Beijing's choosing. Pema Khandu, the chief minister of Arunachal Pradesh, the Indian state sitting immediately downstream of the project, has publicly called the dam a big threat, warning it could dry up the river through his state during routine operation and potentially be weaponized during a future conflict. Local communities along the river have voiced similarly urgent concerns. The Adi tribal community in Arunachal Pradesh, whose traditional way of life is closely tied to the Siang River's natural rhythms, has warned that sudden water releases from the dam could trigger catastrophic flooding, threatening not just agricultural livelihoods but centuries of cultural heritage built along the riverbanks. Human rights organizations have echoed broader ecological concerns about the irreversible damage large-scale damming could inflict on a region considered one of the most biodiverse landscapes on the entire Tibetan Plateau, home to some of Asia's tallest and oldest trees, and an extraordinary concentration of large carnivore species found almost nowhere else on Earth. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated, and where a fair, even-handed account has to push back against the more sensational framing that's dominated a lot of the coverage. Several hydrologists and Chinese officials have pointed to a detail that complicates the water weapon narrative considerably. The majority of the Brahmaputra's total water volume doesn't actually originate in Tibet at all. According to hydrological studies, somewhere between 65 and 70% of the river's annual discharge is generated within India itself, primarily through monsoon rainfall and the dozens of tributary rivers that join the Brahmaputra after it crosses the border. Only about a quarter of the river's total flow is estimated to come from snowmelt and glacial sources in the upper Tibetan reaches, where China's dam is located. That hydrological reality has led some officials to push back hard against the more alarmist framing dominating headlines. Assam's chief minister, Himanta Biswa Sarma, has gone so far as to suggest that if China genuinely does reduce upstream flow, it might, counterintuitively, help mitigate the severe annual flooding that already displaces hundreds of thousands of people across Assam every single monsoon season. Flooding that has long been one of the state's most devastating recurring natural disasters, entirely independent of anything happening upstream in Tibet. That's a genuinely important nuance, and it deserves real weight in this conversation. But it doesn't fully settle the debate either, and here's why. Even if China's dam can't single-handedly drain the Brahmaputra dry during an average year, the concern isn't really about average years. It's about extraordinary ones, moments of acute political tension, deliberate short-term manipulation of flow timing rather than total annual volume, or the simple, uncomfortable fact that India currently has almost no reliable, independently verified information about how the dam will actually be operated day to day, because China has not released comprehensive environmental impact assessments or detailed operational plans for outside scrutiny. Uncertainty itself. Olaf, in a relationship already strained by an unresolved border dispute and a history of open military conflict, tends to breed exactly the kind of anxiety we're seeing play out in Indian political discourse right now, regardless of whether the worst-case fears turn out to be technically achievable in practice. And there's a third dimension to this story that has nothing to do with geopolitics at all, and everything to do with plain physical safety. A risk raised not by Indian critics or Western journalists, but by Chinese scientists themselves. In July 2026, a study conducted by researchers from Chengdu University of Technology, working alongside the state-backed China Geological Survey, confirmed something genuinely alarming. An active geological fault, known as the Paizhen Fault, runs directly beneath the dam's reservoir and construction zone. According to the research, this fault system has remained tectonically active since the last ice age, with documented movement as recently as roughly 9,500 years ago, a blink of an eye in geological time. The eastern Himalayas, where this entire project sits, mark the boundary where the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates continue to grind against each other, a collision that created the Himalayan mountain range in the first place and continues to generate some of the most frequent and violent earthquakes anywhere on the planet. The researchers specifically cited a powerful magnitude 6.9 earthquake that struck the nearby town of Mil in Tibet in 2017, right at the northern edge of this same fault line, as a stark reminder of just how seismically active this exact region remains today. What makes this particular finding so significant is precisely where it came from. This wasn't an outside critic or a foreign government trying to score political points against Beijing. It was Chinese, state-supervised researchers, including scientists affiliated with the Civil-Military Integration Center of the China Geological Survey, publishing findings in a Chinese-language scientific journal that directly undercut the government's own public assurances about the project's safety. The research team's recommendation wasn't to abandon the project, but it was serious. Engineers, they urged, need to implement substantial retaining protections and slope reinforcements, specifically to guard against catastrophic landslides in the surrounding terrain. That's a notably different tone than the celebratory project of the century language coming from state media. And it's a reminder that attempting to build the largest, most expensive single infrastructure project in human history inside one of the most seismically unstable landscapes on Earth is not a decision anyone, Chinese or Indian, should treat lightly. To be fair to the engineering teams involved, seismic risk in this exact region isn't news to Chinese planners. Building at this scale in the Himalayas has always meant grappling with genuinely extreme, unavoidable geological hazards. Landslides, rockfalls, slope, instability, and earthquake risk are woven into the physical reality of the entire eastern Himalayan region, dam or no dam. The Chinese researchers' findings don't necessarily suggest the project is doomed to fail, but they do puncture, in an unusually direct and internally sourced way, Beijing's confident public messaging that this project poses no meaningful risk to anyone, upstream or down. So how has India actually responded, beyond formal diplomatic protests and public statements of concern, with a dam of its own? Shortly after China's Christmas Eve 2024 approval of the Tibetan project, India's Water Ministry revived a long-dormant 2017 proposal known as the Siang Upper Multipurpose Project, an 11,000-megawatt hydroelectric dam planned for construction on the Indian side of the border, just downstream from where the Yarlung-Tsangpo crosses into Arunachal Pradesh. If built, it would become India's single largest hydroelectric dam, and the strategic logic behind it is explicit rather than subtle. As Arunachal Pradesh's chief minister put it, the project isn't just about generating electricity. It's about maintaining a reliable, natural flow of water into Indian territory and mitigating the potential flood risks that could result from China's own dam releases upstream. In effect, India wants a large enough reservoir of its own to buffer against whatever China decides to do with the river's flow, giving New Delhi some measure of control that doesn't depend entirely on Beijing's cooperation or goodwill. That plan comes with real complications of its own, and this is where the story takes on a slightly ironic edge. Some environmental experts have pointed out that India's proposed counterdam could inflict roughly as much ecological and social damage as the Chinese project it's designed to guard against, potentially displacing local communities, disrupting fragile mountain ecosystems, and facing significant local opposition from indigenous groups in Arunachal Pradesh who are wary of large-scale infrastructure altering a river system their communities have depended on for generations. In other words, the response to an upstream megadam that critics say threatens the environment and local livelihoods is a downstream megadam that risks doing something remarkably similar, just under a different flag. Diplomatically, both countries maintain a formal channel called the expert-level mechanism, established specifically to facilitate hydrological data sharing and flood season cooperation between India and China regarding their shared rivers. India has repeatedly pushed to strengthen and formalize this mechanism, calling for more consistent, transparent data exchange, particularly ahead of monsoon seasons when flood risk peaks across the entire Brahmaputra basin. China's cooperation through this channel has been inconsistent at best. Data sharing arrangements have been suspended and resumed multiple times over the past several years, generally tracking the broader temperature of the overall China-India relationship rather than operating as a stable, depoliticized technical arrangement, the way water sharing agreements ideally should. Some regional analysts have floated the idea of India and Bangladesh coordinating jointly, potentially pursuing a formal tripartite agreement grounded in the 1997 UN Watercourses Convention, an international framework governing the rights and obligations of nations sharing transboundary rivers. Whether Beijing, which has never signed on to that particular convention, would ever agree to be bound by its provisions remains a genuinely open and difficult question, Bangladesh sitting even further downstream and even more exposed to whatever happens upstream in both India and China, has separately sought technical information from Beijing about the project's likely impact on its own water security, adding a third nation's anxiety to an already complicated regional equation. Let's dig a little deeper into the engineering itself, because the sheer audacity of what China is attempting here deserves more attention than a passing mention of tunnels and turbines. To capture that dramatic 2,000-meter elevation drop at the Great Bend, engineers aren't simply building a wall across the river the way most people picture a traditional dam. Instead, the plan involves excavating 4 separate tunnels, each roughly 20 kilometers long, bored directly through the solid rock of Namcha Barwa Mountain, one of the tallest and most physically imposing peaks in the eastern Himalayas. Water from the Yarlung Tongpo will be diverted into these tunnels, dropping through the mountain's interior to reach turbines positioned at a much lower elevation, before eventually being returned to the river's natural course further downstream. This is what engineers mean when they describe the project as run-of-river. Rather than a conventional reservoir-based dam, the water isn't primarily meant to be stored behind a wall for extended periods, but rather redirected, dropped through turbines to generate electricity, and released back into the river relatively quickly. In theory, that design should limit the kind of long-term water storage that would let China dramatically reduce downstream flow for extended stretches of time. In practice, the sheer scale of the infrastructure involved and the total absence of independently published operational details means outside observers are being asked to take that reassurance largely on faith. The broader project isn't actually a single dam at all, but a cascade of 5 separate hydropower stations working in sequence along the same stretch of river, sometimes referred to collectively by the name Midog Hydropower Station, after the county in Tibet, where much of the construction is centered. The entire complex is being built and owned by Power Construction Corporation of China, commonly known as Power China, a massive state-owned enterprise responsible for a huge share of the country's domestic hydropower infrastructure over the past several decades. Beyond the dam itself, the broader project is expected to require extensive expansion of ultra-high voltage direct current transmission lines, the specialized long-distance power infrastructure needed to carry electricity generated in remote Tibet all the way to major population centers and industrial hubs in provinces like Sichuan and Yunnan, hundreds of kilometers away. That transmission build-out is itself a massive undertaking, layered on top of the dam construction, and it underscores just how deeply this single project is woven into China's broader, decades-long strategy of using its western frontier regions as a source of clean energy to power its more densely populated eastern provinces. It's also worth understanding the environmental stakes on China's own side of the border, separate entirely from the concerns radiating outward toward India and Bangladesh. The Yarlung Tsangpo Grand Canyon is regarded by Chinese ecologists themselves as one of the most precious biodiversity hotspots anywhere on the planet, a place where dramatic elevation changes packed into a relatively small geographic area create an extraordinary range of microclimates and habitats, all layered on top of each other along the canyon's steep walls. The region is home to some of Asia's tallest and most ancient trees, including specimens. Climbers have documented as the tallest trees anywhere on the continent, alongside what researchers describe as the richest concentration of large carnivore species found anywhere in Asia, from snow leopards to clouded leopards to a range of other big cats that depend on the region's largely undisturbed forest cover. Constructing an infrastructure project of this scale, the tunneling, the access roads, the worker camps, the transmission corridors, inevitably disturbs at least some portion of that fragile ecosystem, and because comprehensive environmental impact assessments have not been made public, independent scientists outside China have had limited ability to evaluate exactly how severe or how permanent that disturbance is likely to be. There's also a human displacement dimension worth acknowledging, honestly, because large-scale hydropower projects in China have historically come with significant costs for local communities. The Three Gorges Dam, the project this new complex is specifically designed to surpass, famously required the relocation of more than 1 million people from towns and villages that were subsequently flooded by the dam's massive reservoir. The Yarlung Tsangpo project's run-of-river design, without the same kind of enormous permanent reservoir, may ultimately require substantially less large-scale resettlement than Three Gorges did. But the remote, mountainous, and ethnically Tibetan character of the region introduces its own separate set of sensitivities. Tibet has long been one of the most politically fraught regions inside China's borders, with a documented history of tension between Beijing's central government and the local population over questions of cultural autonomy, religious practice, and land rights. A construction project of this scale, requiring tens of thousands of workers, extensive new road networks, and permanent alterations to one of the region's most significant rivers, inevitably intersects with those broader, decades-old tensions. Even though Chinese state media coverage of the dam has largely avoided any direct discussion of this dimension, preferring instead to frame the project purely in terms of clean energy achievement and national economic development. Stepping back, it's worth asking honestly what happens if none of the worst-case fears materialize, if the dam does operate largely as China describes, if the seismic risks are successfully engineered around, if India's counterdam gets built without catastrophic consequences of its own, and if diplomatic tensions between the two countries never escalate to the point where anyone would seriously consider manipulating river flow as a tool of coercion. Even in that optimistic scenario, the underlying strategic reality doesn't disappear. China will have built and will permanently control the ability to alter the flow of a river that more than 130 million people across two sovereign nations depend on for water security. That capability exists whether or not it's ever actually used aggressively. And in international relations, capability itself, not just intent, tends to shape how neighboring governments plan, negotiate, and posture toward each other for decades to come. That's arguably the real, lasting legacy of this project, regardless of how the engineering, environmental, and safety questions ultimately resolve themselves over the coming decade. Zoom out far enough, and the single dam becomes a story about something much larger than hydropower or even bilateral tension between two Asian giants. Since 2000, China has proposed nearly 200 hydropower projects across the Tibetan Plateau, source of nearly every major river system across South and Southeast Asia. Not just the Brahmaputra, but the Mekong, the Salween, the Indus, sustaining well over 1 billion people across more than a dozen countries. Tibet has earned the nickname the Water Tower of Asia for this reason. An enormous share of the continent's fresh water originates on a plateau sitting entirely within China's political control. As China expands its hydropower footprint across that plateau, project by project, the question facing every downstream nation, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Pakistan, becomes less about any single piece of infrastructure and more about a slow structural shift in geopolitical leverage, one river system at a time. Whether the Yarlung Changpo Dam proves to be the environmental catastrophe critics fear, the diplomatic weapon Indian officials warn about, the engineering disaster Chinese seismologists worry could unfold along an active fault, or simply the clean energy Triumph Beijing insists it will become, is a question without a clear answer for at least another decade. Construction alone is expected to take that long, with the earliest sections not coming online until the early to mid-2030s. What's already certain is this. For the first time in modern history, the water security of well over 100 million people across two of the world's most populous nations now depends, in significant part, on decisions made inside a single country, about a single river, with almost no outside.